Hello, folks, and welcome to World War II. Everybody's favorite World War except for mine. Not that I have anything against World War II, but I personally find World War I a lot more interesting in some ways. However, World War II, has lots of good lessons for us and is very valuable to learn about. So I'm still really excited. So excited. I love a good World War. We're going to try for 20 minutes on this lecture and just see how far that gets us. So, fortunately, we've already talked about what fascism is, so hopefully we could just move through this a little bit more quickly. Okay, so, World War I. How did we get here? Well, first things first, the Treaty of Versailles did not help. A lot of people argue that World Wars I and II are just the same war with a brief pause in between. After World War I, we have a lot of really gnarly stuff happening. We have the Treaty of Versailles, which basically stomps on Germany, and things start to go really badly. So, German resentment and a failing economy and a bad government leads to Nazis. That's the quick and easy definition of this, essentially. So we have the Treaty of Versailles. It crashes the German economy because they have to pay back reparations and they have no money to build up their infrastructure or their economy. And it also creates a lot of German resentment because they're receiving all of the blame for World War I, and they aren't allowed to do things like build up their army and stuff like that, which leads a group that is focused on making war seem very noble, about bringing back German pride, about fixing the economy with strong leadership. It makes them seem very attractive and allows them to gain power more easily than they would if perhaps Germany had been in a better headspace, let's say. The Nazis are all about war, and they're all upset. And then we also sort of get this, not just the Nazis, but we end up with this territorial expansion stuff from Hitler. So, first off, they have a rearmament program in 1935 where they start building up their military again. And basically the rest of Europe is like, hey now, what you doing? Should you be doing that? And Germany's like, I don't know, I don't care, I'm gonna do it anyway. And well, just don't point them at us. In 1936, they take back over the Rhineland, which had been traditionally a part of Germany for a while. And again, the rest of Europe was like, well, they had been part of Germany, so I guess it's not that big of a deal. In 1938, they take over Austria and the German-speaking parts of Czechoslovakia. And again, the rest of Europe, mainly Britain and France, are like, well, maybe if we let them have these German-speaking parts of things, then they'll stop and they'll be content when they've captured all of the German stuff. No, that's not how Hitler goes. So finally, in 1939, Germany tries to invade Poland, and finally, Britain and France are like, all right, they speak Polish, not German, we're going to have to stop you there. Okay, so, oh look, Stalin. Oh look, troops. Anyways. Oh look, Hitler. Ugh. How did we get to the road to war? How did we get to war in Asia? First things first, mostly it's about Japan. Japan also was treated badly by the Treaty of Versailles because even though they won, they were considered to be inferior because they weren't white, so they got none of the winners' prizes from World War I. So instead, they're like, all right, we're going to become our own major empire. At the same time, we have threats of Chinese nationalism, which means that the Japanese are really clamping down on China and their holdings in China in Manchuria. So they officially seize control in 1931 with a puppet state called the Manchukuo. And this actually is where communism really starts to take a foothold in China, because the only people who are actually fighting against Japan are the communists. and like helping the average Chinese person. The actual political party ruling the Republic of China, the KMT or the Kuomintang, they are not actually doing a good job in fending off the Japanese. So the farmers and the peasants, they're big fans of the Communist Party, not so much the KMT. Westerners are angry, and Japan withdraws from the League of Nations. They actually attack the Chinese heartland in 1937. And also, the other really big thing that Japan has is they have oil interests in the South Pacific. Interests. Guess who else has oil interests in the South Pacific? The United States. Huh. That's not going to cause problems later. Speaking of which, today, and there goes some Japanese troops marching into, I believe, Beijing. Here also is a political cartoon. This is not China, that's Korea. You can tell it's Korea from the outfit that he's wearing, and also because the caption says, the Korean government has decided to preserve a strict neutrality in the event of war between Japan and Russia, but you'll notice that Japan and Russia are both trying to get Korea, and therefore strangling Korea in between them in the process. No, what I was saying was it's very interesting that currently gas prices, oil prices have fallen so low that oil companies are literally paying people to take their barrels of oil away for them. Something that I don't think I've ever seen in my adult life. Okay, so Japan is also really resentful. Oh, look, there's that South Pacific stuff coming back. Japan is also really resentful. They feel like European racism is stymieing their power. So even though they won World War I, along with the U.S. or the United Kingdom, they have a smaller navy because they are granted a smaller navy by, like, the League of Nations. So they're like, hey, we should be allowed to have however big a navy we want. And the United States and the UK and other powers that be are stepping in and saying, no, I don't think you should. I think you should have as big a navy as we decide. And then there's lots of anti-immigration policies in the United States that are specifically against the Japanese, and not just the Japanese, but against basically all Asians. There's lots of racism against people from Asia, and again, it doesn't just have to do with the Japanese or the Chinese, it extends to everybody in Asia. And the reason you see so many like Chinese food restaurants is because that was one of the few industries in which Chinese people were allowed to like bring family members from China to join them. If you opened a Chinese food restaurant, you were allowed to like bring your brother. And since there were so few other opportunities to immigrate available, that's what a lot of Chinese immigrants did. They're also dependent on a lot of foreign resources, especially for things like that oil. And there's lots of regional competitors as well. There's a lot of people hanging out in Indonesia and sort of that area that the Japanese want to be able to kick out. So they start taking over Indonesia in 1940 and 1941, and in fact, we get kicked out of Indonesia pretty darn badly right during this time period, and this is where we're going to talk about like the Bataan death marches and stuff like that. We'll get a little bit to that later when we come back to the Pacific Theater. Then, because of this whole business, the Americans put an oil embargo on Japan in July of 1941, which essentially means no more oil for Japan. Per the United States, they see Japan as an aggressive threat. So, Japan is like, we've got to take care of the Americans and get them out of the South Pacific. How do we do that? We hit their navy as hard as we can. How do we do that? By attacking Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. And on December 7th, 1941, and then we enter the war like a few days later. Ultimately, Japan is unable to defend itself adequately against the United States, and the United States eventually will, with help from other people, crush Japan. But then America comes in and is like, hey, Japan, how about we help you to recover after the war? And Japan is like, okay. And ultimately, Japan recovers very successfully. So it's not all bad, but there's plenty of bad mixed in there. Likewise with Pearl Harbor. Pearl Harbor was a horrific attack. Thousands and thousands of people died. The USS Arizona in particular, it sank with basically everybody on board. They had such a limited amount of time to try and get out that basically everybody was killed on that ship. It was something like 1,200 people, most of them young men. And they tried to, it's really horrifying too, because a lot of them were trapped. And so this ship sank and they weren't killed instantly. They suffocated over a matter of days. And sometimes they would, and in a couple of cases, they tried to go and rescue people. And as they were opening the ship compartments underwater, it would flood, and the people they were trying to rescue ultimately would drown. So a lot of these things are incredibly tragic. A lot of the stuff we're going to talk about in World War II is profoundly, profoundly tragic. So brace yourselves. It does not get better from here. I believe that's the Arizona going down, but that's definitely from Pearl Harbor. And here we have Japanese holdings in the dark blue, and then as they start to push into a lot of the other areas and islands. So we had been in the Philippines. We had holdings in the Philippines. You can see it says USA, and then the Japanese came in and kicked us out, and we had to have to go back in and retake it. We no longer have the Philippines because they're their own country now. So here is a picture of American soldiers, I believe it is, yes, marching around in South Pacific. Okay, so overview of the war. The Blitzkrieg of Poland is the tipping point to war. A Blitzkrieg. Blitzkrieg literally means like lightning war. Essentially, the German policy. Blitzkrieg. German words are so fun. German words are basically like, hey, let's make a mishmash of everything we can and see what happens. So there's a delightful chart about like, is it a pig? Is it not a pig? Is it sort of a pig? Let's name it, Fuzzy Pig. And it's actually a raccoon. So a Blitzkrieg is lightning, and they're referring to the speed war. And they basically just came in and hit Poland as hard as they could. And Britain and France are over here going, whoa, what the heck? We have to do something. But the Nazis moved so fast. So if we have our map of Europe, I'm going to have to draw Europe. So sorry, Europe. My bad. Okay. There's Britain, its little sock in Ireland. And then we have France-ish and Spain. And then we go down here to Italy and stuff. Blah, 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 blah. And Scandinavia, Russia. And Russia's over here being like, we're friends, aren't we, Hitler? And Hitler's like, sure, buddy. So here's Germany-ish. Now, Germany had already expanded to take over parts of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Then they move up into Poland and start conquering that. Then they occupy Denmark, and then they've occupied Holland, Belgium, and Luxembourg, and Italy is on their side, so that's not super fun. Then, that's basically all of that in there, they go up and they conquer Norway as well, which is one of these guys up here. I can never remember which. So, and then Spain's over here just kind of sort of doing their own vaguely fascist thing. So we have our allies are Great Britain and France, but then we have Switzerland over here staying neutral. And Russia at this point as well is like, meh, I think we're going to stay neutral for a while. And that means that all of the USSR countries that they have taken over are going to be neutral as well. So Germany essentially has taken over as many areas as they can very, very quickly. They start essentially in like February, March of 1940, and by May, they have all of that territory up here in green. That is incredibly quickly. And the Nazis start to head towards France. And then, by June, France surrenders, because Mussolini has joined Germany, and so everybody is falling. So There we go. Now, it's not all bad. Charles de Gaulle is a French general who forms the Free French Army in London and later becomes Prime Minister of France. They name a whole airport after him. The French resistance is super famous. So there's this really, like, when I was a kid, there was this weird anti-France, like, mentality. It's very bizarre. But France actually, even though they were conquered by Germany, they still played a really large part in the anti-German efforts. Okay, so the Nazis turned their sights on England. And while this is happening, Japan is doing stuff too. So Japan joins the Axis powers in 1940. So these guys are the Axis powers. So Axis equals Germany. Our big players are Germany, Italy, and Japan. Hey, this looks familiar. And then our allies are Britain. And then later, Russia and the United States will join them. But again, the US has to be poked into war from Japan. And Russia is not interested in fighting against Germany at this point because they're having issues over here. And they were kind of sort of buddies from the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So it's like Russia's not super into fighting against Germany. So Japan joins the Axis powers in 1940. They seize French Indochina in 1941, which is Vietnam, so Vietnam. The quality of the pho goes down because they're not able to get access to quality ingredients anymore. FDR freezes Japanese funds in the US, blocks the sale of oil, and then Japan retaliates by the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. It wasn't actually as much of a surprise as we think it is, in like the common American mindset, because in the common American mindset, we're over here like, came out of nowhere, we never saw it coming, it was a complete surprise. But actually Japan was like, hey, we're gonna do something like this, and we were like, they'll never reach us. And so we didn't take it seriously. But it's also really important for us not to forget that the US took very serious steps against its Japanese American population. And it's really important to remember that it was very largely the Japanese American population. So Order 9066 was the order from FDR to do Japanese internment. I don't remember the numbers off the top of my head, but it was huge amounts of Japanese people were rounded up from their homes, forced to either sell their homes and businesses or try desperately to have somebody look after them for while they were gone for an unknown amount of time, or their homes and buildings oftentimes were just taken by other people. So a lot of times these Japanese Americans came back to their homes to find another family living in it. Because a lot of them were in internment camps for the duration of the war. So a lot of them were in internment camps for anywhere between 1 to 4 to 5 years. Again, I think I've mentioned this before, but if you are looking for a really excellent book about the Japanese internment, They Called Us Enemy is a graphic novel memoir by George Takei about growing up in a Japanese internment camp when he was a kid. So this is one of our dark moments in US history, because so many of these Japanese people had no loyalty to Japan, felt very concerned and upset about the entire situation, and were rounded up, weren't trusted, were rounded up, and were put into concentration camps. And while they might not have been quite as bad as the ones in Germany, we cannot ignore the fact that they were concentration camps and that people were treated unfairly and their constitutional rights were trampled. Okay, so that's depressing. Moving on. By late 41, early 42, the Axis powers are winning, and Yugoslavia and Greece are captured by the Axis powers. So, Greece is over here. I added Greece on. Doing. And the Axis powers are also advancing in North Africa and the Soviet Union. And so FDR and Churchill is the Prime Minister of the UK, previously famous for the Gallipoli incident. Do you remember where in World War One they tried to in Turkey they tried to charge up the hills from the water to try and take over Istanbul? Yeah, that didn't work so well, but somehow Churchill managed to like turn his whole PR campaign around and become the Prime Minister of the UK and become essentially a hero out of this. They decide that they have to attack Germany before Japan, and they've got to really concentrate on that. In 1942, the Russians and the Chinese finally joined the Allies. The Chinese mostly because they just hadn't really had an opportunity to do so before. Russia because they're finally pissed off at Hitler. So here we have FDR is on the left and Churchill is on the right, meeting to discuss things. Bombings. So during this time period, everybody is using air power and the Air Force to start actually bombing cities. Instead of having just ground support and ground troops, now we also have air support and air armies, essentially. So these planes are flying over cities, dropping bombs, and this is the kind of destruction that you're seeing. Entire buildings leveled, entire cities are just absolutely destroyed, and people start having to take really extreme measures to protect against this. So, for example, the cathedral in Notre Dame in France, they took and they did this in Westminster Abbey too, in London, in the United Kingdom. They took every piece of stained glass out of the windows and buried them. They like wrapped each one individually and like buried them in the yard, essentially, so that if the bombs were dropped on the cathedrals, at least the glass didn't shatter. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and stop there for today, but hopefully we can get this done in 4 installments. The last one might be a little bit long. Thank you for joining me. Hope you check out some of the books that I've been talking about. They're all really interesting and good to add to your knowledge. But, hey, you're busy. I understand if you don't. It's okay. I will see you next lecture. Have a lovely rest of your day. Take care.